Okay. So why don't Mark and Jamie just briefly, they're going to introduce themselves. But what I would also like them to do is just to give a little bit of context. Maybe you have an idea of their role, but you don't know behind the scenes some of the weight or just the relationships or the cares that they're carrying in this time. So Mark, why don't we just start with you, then we'll go to Jamie, and then I'll end.
Okay, so really quickly, our family context is our one son is going back to work tomorrow. He's a foreman on a site in Ottawa. He's an electrician. Our other son, Taylor, has been dealing with COVID patients as they've come in ever so slowly to the emergency and KGH. He's dealt with a couple patients. And our daughter, Lindsay, is living overseas, working in a hospital as a social worker. And my wife is doing a placement for her master's in psychotherapy, and she's been doing tons of counseling online. So that's our context in the background.
My context is Rob and I are both actually still working because he's in delivery, so that's considered an essential service. And my daughter is actually still living here, and she works at Queen's, so she's been working at home. So we've had two of us here working, and it's pretty good. I mean, my biggest levels of heartache would probably be because I had two twin granddaughters born 6 weeks ago, and I have not been able to get out and see them. So that's been really tough. And I also have a mom who's living by herself, which is just down the road for me. But this makes it her as well. So okay.
You're caring for a lot of people right now. Yeah. So I'm Amanda. You know who I am. I think my demographics I represent a bunch of people who are single and living alone and not with any immediate community or in your vicinity. So that's kind of my context. So you'll hear kind of those three, but we just wanted to call out, there's a bunch of people here who are retired. So I'm sure you will have things to contribute, or maybe your life hasn't changed that much. And then we also recognize that none of us right now have kids in the house that need attending, as Mark or the fathers have said, help us, we need some adult stimulation. So we just also want to say we're missing, in terms of our panel and our sharing, that discussion. And so if you feel like you're coming with that background and have something to offer, we would love to hear from you, because again, we're not experts and we're just sharing what we're learning, but not having to deal with the weights that you are if you're retired or your concerns are different with kids. So we'd love to hear from you on that. So Mark and Jamie, one of the first questions we thought, I'm going to just kind of go kind of small to big, everyone. I'm going to start with some personal questions, just around like character, personality, and just dealing with transition and change. And then we're going to talk a little bit more of how to deal with that in a work context. I know all of us are in ministry, but some of us are still changing and dealing with jobs. And then we're going to just briefly end at talking from a pastoral perspective and change around Bethel and just in terms of ministry and what God is doing. So that's where we're headed, and that's where we'd like to end, is talking about the church and everything really which brought us together. So Mark, why don't you just start by addressing some of the personal questions. Give us something that you have found that has worked for you in this time.
Yep. So real quick and real simple, it's just simply accepting the reality that this is the way the world is right now, and not necessarily fighting it or being angry about it or frustrated, but realizing this is the new normal. And the illustration I would use is the previous life before COVID-19. It felt like we were standing on a kind of a solid platform where things are predictable, and life has unfolded this way. All of a sudden, it's like you're standing on a surfboard. The wave is changing, and your core is always engaged. And so, just accepting that, then moving from acceptance to making changes in terms of how you live, how you work, what to expect of yourself, and even what to expect of others. Because sometimes people can be a little irritable. Because it's a little harder riding a surfboard than it is standing on a firm foundation. So that's what's worked. Key word is acceptance.
Jamie?
For me, creating a routine has helped. Going for walks has really helped. And kind of the same idea as Mark, just acknowledging that This feels really, really different, and it's okay to feel tired or, a little bit flat about the way it is right now. So I think I was, as an upbeat person, I was trying to feel upbeat about it, and I was finding that hard.
And what about you,
and
Amanda?
I would, I would say, for me, I think I read an article a couple of years ago on decision fatigue, and they were just saying that a lot of because we have to make so many choices, even with like cell phones now, do we respond to this text now or later? Do we leave it? That they're saying that we're getting a lot of fatigue because we have micro decisions every day. So one of the things that I just do every week, because everything's changing so quickly, is kind of every week I decide my schedule, when I'm going to work out, like what my routine will be, if I go in the office, when that will be. And I have found that's given me a lot of flexibility to make decisions in my job. I have capacity to make adjustments there. And so trying to save myself the micro decisions by making them basically weekly until we have a better sense of what's happening, rather than trying to make plans long term and then having to change them, because that's also very tiring. So similar to routine, but just an ability to adjust within that.
Yeah.
But I know all of us don't think that we figured it out. We were talking about this, and we've talked about it as a staff. There are things that we have been doing that have not been working so well, personally.
Yeah.
So maybe, just speak to that, Mark and Jamie. What have you found you tried and it didn't work, or it worked for a bit, now it's not working anymore?
So for me, real quickly, when this thing hit, you're always looking for the expert in the room. Whenever you're in a crisis or a problem, like you go to the doctor, you're looking for an expert in the room, right? In this particular situation, there is no expert in the room. There's a saying, we're all in this together. I think you could actually rephrase that and say, we are all lost in this together. And so what has not worked is thinking that there's somebody that has the green pill or whatever that will fix it all and knows exactly what to do. I've sat in a lot of citywide meetings, and some of the smartest people in the room have no clue what they're doing, and they'll admit that. So it doesn't pay to think that there's an expert out there. There isn't. So we're kind of all lost in this together. So it's not work to look for the expert.
Jamie?
I answered this more on a personal level. What hasn't worked for me is not reaching out to people. That has not worked. So I've tried after a few weeks of being really, really intentional of reaching out to the people that I need to reach out to. So, because I'm like Brent, I'm an extrovert. So, and also not getting out. Getting outside has been really, really important for me as well, to keep up, just to keep things upbeat for me. That really, really helps. So, but I wasn't really thinking work. I was thinking more personal. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Mark and Jamie are both extroverts, and then I'm an introvert, but I have not found it helpful. Maybe it's just being alone. Like, I found that I planned too many meetings and transferred everything to Zoom, and then I would hit the end of my day or halfway through the week, and I hadn't had really any conversations that felt like they were more about how I was doing. And so I think one of the things, this was true before, I just had to relearn it. Like, you have to manage your personal life a little more intentionally when you're single, because otherwise, and live alone, because those things don't just happen. And so I definitely hit a wall where I was like, I don't want to talk to any of my friends on Zoom, but I need to talk to people who actually know me, as opposed to like walking into every Zoom meeting and having to facilitate like this. So that was a mistake. Whoops. And then when you're an introvert, you think being alone is the helpful thing, and it's not. You actually just need some quality time with people. And the other thing which was helpful is, and I was talking to my leadership coach about this, is she said that before, they've done lots of studies, and only 3.5 hours of productive work actually get done a day. I think it's the same when you like homeschool your kids versus send them to school, how much shorter the work time actually is, as opposed to, that full day. And so she's like, everyone's sitting down at their computers and expecting to do 8 hours of productive Zoom work, and we somehow expect that from ourselves repeatedly. And so just kind of letting go of feeling productive for a full day of work has also really helped me in general, with being more productive in spurts rather than in a long period of time. So that has helped. And the next question we wanted to talk about, because Mark actually brought this up in staff meeting, and I think this is a really great question, because I think in crisis or in transition, we all kind of go into our sort of like high adaptability, coping mechanisms. And so he actually asked us the question that I think you'd heard, Mark, in a leaders meeting, like, what is your derailer? So what I think he meant by that is what gets in the way of you being effective in a crisis? What can sideline you or make you less productive? So we talked about that a bit as a staff, and truthfully, even I think some of us knew other people's derailers more closely than we knew our own, because we could see it. So for example, it's like, oh, I want everything to be perfect, but in transition, that's probably not going to happen. So anyway, I want to speak to that, Mark and Jamie. Like, what are some one or two of your derailers that get in the way? Maybe Jamie, you can go first. That get in the way of you being effective.
Technology that doesn't work really derails me, and high learning curves. So I felt like when we had to move everything online, there was just a lot of high learning curves, and then watching what other churches were doing, where it's can be very defeating. Feeling. So it's kind of like, well, we can't do that. So anyway, and then just like all of the learning. So yeah, well, those are kind of things that, just the amount of information out there too can be so paralyzing, right, for you. So those things really do.
So can I just make a clarifying comment there? Are you saying like you would compare, and that would kind of make you feel defeated? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So comparison. Okay. And I also remember, Jamie, you saying that, like, Craig Rochelle, I think, gave a talk and basically said in leadership in general, this was before crisis, and I wouldn't even say in leadership, I think probably in life, but particularly in crisis, we have to remember good enough is kind of the phrase. Like, we got something out there, and it may not be perfect and polished, but it's something. And remembering that was a staff phrase we used for the Easter service behind the scenes, guys. Full disclosure, we're like, it's good enough. So that was a step.
I had that down as another.
Mark, Mark, what's a derailer or two for you?
Yeah, I think one of my derailers would be, I would use an analogy. It's like, you lift a 747, the plane takes a lot of energy to get it up and get it up into the air. And so I think as a church, as a staff, if you're working in business, there's a lot of energy exerted in that first number of days to lift off, to get yourself distanced from gravity and get up into the air. And so that expends a lot of energy. But I think a derailer can be, you get up in the air, and if it's a good flight, you should stay at 30,000 feet, no turbulence, watch a movie, have some airplane food, and all's good. But in this new reality, the derailer can be all of a sudden the weather patterns change, the news changes, and you have to drop down to 10,000 feet, and then all of a sudden you have to go to 20,000, and then you all of a sudden have to, and so there's this constant shifting. And so it's a little bit related to my previous answer. It's just you never kind of get the answer, because the news is always changing. You have a bit of the answer, but there's always this evolution, and so that can actually be draining, and but also stimulating, because it's demanding your creativity and your your dependence upon a team that's around you to think clearly on some of these issues. What about you, Amanda?
Yeah, I think what my derailer is, like, I really like innovating. Like, I just have the ability to have ideas and be thinking outside the box. And when it's like, well, we haven't really done church online before. And I remember it was actually something Carrie said to me. Like, she looked at me at one point, she's like, do you always have this many ideas? And like she's completely overwhelmed. And it was good, because she was just reflecting back to me that just because you have a lot of ideas doesn't mean they all are good ones or they should be pursued. And so I think it kind of helps me. I can be too distracted and not know what's the best. So I can be derailed from effectiveness by thinking everything should get done and not slowing down enough to really listen to, like, either the team or even the Lord about what is the best idea for now. So I just want to encourage, I think that was a great I thought that was a great question that Mark brought to the team. And I thought that was an important one just to share with for yourselves. I think even if you're parents, to kind of see your kids adjusting to crisis, like what are the things that get in the way of them kind of being able to adapt and embrace the present? But even I think for everyone sitting here is knowing what can actually like kind of pull you off this season of change, because and it's usually a strength into a weakness in this, like it's like when you innovate it's great, but when there's too many ideas, not helpful. So it's kind of the flip side. And so I just encourage you to take that question, maybe talk about it. And if you're leading a team or talking to your kids, like I think the people who know you the best are going to probably be able to say, yeah, you tend to fixate on this, or you get like this. And then that was helpful for us as a staff to talk about. So I thought that's worthwhile to bring to this discussion on change. But as we were talking about change, I think one of the things that is helpful, and I think sometimes when we're talking about discipleship and spiritual things, we can neglect to talk about the effect and impact of change on our bodies. So we're just going to talk about, and I would encourage you to use the chat button, is as you've been thinking and dealing with change in your own lives, what are some of the physical symptoms? We've mentioned fatigue has been a massive one. I think everyone has felt that. But, as you've felt transition and change, and whether it's what's happened with COVID or another transition and change in your life, what are some physical symptoms? If you want to type them in the chat box, but maybe Mark, you can speak to some of the symptoms, and Jamie, that you've experienced in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, I would say one is just fat. I'm getting fat. So there you go. That's a physical symptom. And I can't outrun my fork. So no matter how much I run, I can't outrun my fork. So, but in all seriousness, not fat, but flat. A couple of weeks ago, I had a very flat Sunday morning. It was, I'm a pretty buoyant guy. I don't get depressed, pretty steady Eddie, but I felt really, really flat. I didn't feel like myself. I felt unmotivated, gloomy, very unusual. I felt uncomfortable in my own skin because I felt like, who am I? What's going on here? And I actually, as I thought about it and listened to some people that talk about anxiety and all that, I think it was an accumulation of grief and all that's been lost, grief and all that's changing, grief and all of the uncertainty, and just kind of piles up, accumulates in your spirit, in your soul, and so it was a gloomy. And then on top of that, it was raining and it was cold. So so that was one of my symptoms, which was very abnormal because I don't get flat.
That's true. Mark is an optimist. We call him the rainbows and unicorns in staff. So if Mark is not finding a rainbow, we're in trouble. Jamie?
Yeah, I can relate to the flat too as well. So I won't go into that because Mark did a really good explanation of it. But for me, there's been a lot of grief, and I think because of what I'm missing, like not being able to see my granddaughters, has been really tough. And I think for me, it's been hard for me to acknowledge that it's okay to grieve that, because there's this, feeling of guilt that like I'm not experiencing as much, negative things as other people are experiencing. I have a house and we all have spaces to kind of go to. Like there was so much to be thankful for that I felt actually guilty for grieving until I finally couldn't push it anymore, and I had to cry, and so I cried a lot, just to work through that I am actually going to miss some stages as a grandma that I was not wanting to miss. So,
well,
I
Amanda,
think
you?
I like that you both use the word grief, and I actually was sitting in a seminar on Saturday around grief, and when he also asked the question, like, what are you experiencing? And the symptoms actually between grief and fear and anxiety are quite similar, like loss of sleep, change of sleep patterns, as some of you have mentioned, weight gain. For me, I think it's mainly been fatigue and, it's just been emotional, but I think going back to Mark's earlier point about earlier point about acceptance, I think once you just realize you're going to have your up days and your down days, and you're not going to that's not your truth, but it's your feelings. I think not dealing with your feelings isn't helpful, but I would say overall, I mainly had some digestive issues. So I think all of that, I would just want to draw attention to the fact that our bodies sometimes are telling us things that we're maybe not aware of emotionally, and they're just holding it for us. But transition, even if it's positive, usually holds some physical manifestation. And so just to reflect on that, I think for yourself, sleep patterns, I think maybe even for your kids, like this is all normal, a part of change and transition, and grief, fear, and anxiety. Like those are all very overlapping symptoms and very normal part of transition and change. So if you're having all these symptoms, my question would be for you, what are some of your coping mechanisms? And that word has been used, I think, sometimes in a more negative context, but I think we just mean it as a generic, like, how do you step up to the plate in transition? What is your go-tos? Mark, maybe you can speak to that first. So
I would couple that with spiritual disciplines, Amanda, because I know that's one of our questions. So one thing that's been really, really helpful is community. And I heard this phrase just the other day, name it and tame it. And we're not all big on cliches, but that's a pretty good one. And I have found that being in community, so we all can get as much community as we want because we can do it on Zoom. But being in community with a bunch of men or mixed group and hearing people tell their story has helped put language to what I'm feeling. And so that's been huge. And realizing I'm not abnormal, realizing that I'm not losing my mind, giving permission to feel what I'm feeling. So it's been good to hear it reflected back in a community, and words put to it, language put to it has been extremely helpful. So that kind of ties into a spiritual discipline as well. So,
yeah, that's great. Jamie?
I mean, just to say something different than Mark, because that also resonates with me, but also what's been really helpful for me is to continue to do creative things that have absolutely nothing to do with my job. So I think of, okay, what can I do today that is creative? Because that is an outlet for me. So, and it helps me. So whether it's baking, which I try not to do too much of, but I've given away a lot of food in this season. But also like knitting and just doing other stuff like that. So it's been really helpful.
Yeah. Amanda, what about you? What's the go-to for you?
Oh, well, I'm going to confess probably more of a negative one. My go-to is the to-do. Like, it is like, I will be productive. And so it's like, list the house projects, make sure you work out, make sure you're eating healthy. And a couple of weeks ago, I realized that the only person who's being so hard on myself is me. So I needed to like let it go a bit. And so my coping mechanism is the figuring out what to do. And now I need to figure out that it's okay, because I think whenever we kind of adjust or make some decisions moving forward, that there's going to be a whole new to-do list. And so I think one of the more positive ones is I default into, like, I just get physical exercise. I like to cycle. I like to get out. Someone has mentioned that in the chat, just getting outdoors. And as already mentioned, part of community, but one of the things that I have learned about myself, maybe as an introvert, which I think sometimes can be good and bad, is introverts tend to be introspective, like take a lot of our cues from what's going on inside of us. But when you are alone or without the stimulation or being invited into community, even through work, right, you're surrounded by people, sometimes your thoughts don't generally go in a positive upward direction. And so when you actually probably need people the most, you're inclined to be like, well, but my inside doesn't feel so good and I should pay attention to it. And it's actually best then, I have learned, to reach out to someone to just draw you out of yourself and be other focused. So that would be one of my prior coping mechanisms, would have been like kind of introspection. And now it's just like, let's just reach out to someone and be in community. So let's just jump on that, piggyback on that. Mark, you already mentioned spiritual disciplines.
Yeah.
Anything that you've had to kind of, and I would actually be interested, even if in the chat box, anything from the crowd here where you're like, I've had to go after this spiritual discipline more deliberately in this season. Or like I've had to lean in, or being excited to lean into this discipline. So if you just want to put that in the chat box, I'll just let Mark and Jamie speak to some of the disciplines they've had to really intentionally lean into in this time.
So I see here in the chat box, getting outdoors, outside daily walking. So I've always done that, but I think solitude has actually played a bigger part. I hate solitude. I used to go to monasteries and study years ago, and I couldn't stand it because there was nobody around. But in this time, actually, I've actually enjoyed walking through the woods and not talking, not trying to interpret, just kind of breathing in and just absorbing nature, and not trying to even put words to my expression to God, just allowing. It's almost like sitting in a bathtub and just letting the bubbles, the water nurture your body. You're not, just let nature kind of nurture your spirit, your soul. And I have found solitude to be quite helpful, which is not normally my pattern. So that would be one. What about you, Jamie?
Well, solitude is not my thing either. So, but in this season, when you find yourself more in solitude, I have found that I've been doing a couple of things that I don't naturally lean into. And that's going for walks and like playing music while I'm walking, or listening to some really great podcasts, which is not usually the thing I like to do. I'm not an audio learner as much, but I think it's because there is a lot more time, you know what I mean, that you've got to do stuff that's by yourself. So I've been leaning into that, and then using a Bible app that actually is audio as well, which I've hardly ever done in the past. I usually always like to read it, but I've been doing more of that kind of thing. So yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned
Go ahead.
No, I'm glad you mentioned the Bible, because I don't want the church to think that we're not leaning into the Bible. Yeah. What about you, Amanda?
I think, it's always interesting that extroverts are like, oh, I found solitude, because introverts think that we have to be just intentional between solitude and isolation. There's a very distinctive difference there, because you can be alone all the time and still not be in solitude. Like, there's an intentionality that both of you are referring to about spending time with the Lord, not just that you're alone, and enjoying the stillness of that. So I think that always is true. But I would say for me, the discipline I've had to lean in the most is maybe Sabbath, because you could always stay connected. And I think, I preached a sermon on this in the fall, but it's kind of when your whole work shifts, what's the 6.5 days that take up your time? Well, if it's all being online, for me, it's just meant I need to unplug. So I've just had to kind of jig my Sabbath in a way that feels like I am not going to get distracted. I'm not connected in a way that will pull me away from God. So yeah, other than the other disciplines mentioned, and I see some people also mentioning prayer. I think a lot leaning into to praying and hearing from God, because I've had space to do that. I walk to work rather than bike. That gives me time to pray and listen. And so I'm just enjoying the spaciousness of that. So just to end, as we transition, not to end, but just a section before we talk about how you've adjusted work, I added in a question this morning that I thought would be interesting. And we've kind of been getting at it, but I would ask Mark and Jamie, just how have you been leaning into your faith? Like as you're coming into transition, and I'm saying this personally, not from take your pastor hats off. How has your faith informed transition and change or adjustment? Yeah. What do you do or need from your spiritual journey right now? So either I think Mark, we had talked, maybe Mark will go first, and then Jamie and I can go after.
Jamie, Jamie, you need to Google an answer. Go ahead real quick. I'll close on. No, I think for me, it's asking the question, what is God wanting me to do, and how is he wanting me to be, or how is he shaping me in this season? Because I think in crisis and pandemics, this is my first experience. You panic and you look to the left, you look to the right, to try to figure out what's going on. Sometimes I think we need to take a big, deep breath, myself, and go, okay, God, what are you doing here? What's going on here? How are you speaking to me personally? How are you shaping me? And even as a church, what are you wanting to do in us, through us? And then as I work within some of the city context, what's God doing in Kingston? Where are there new opportunities? So I just think, having an open posture and asking that question: what is God doing in me, through me? Who does He want me to be in this season? How does He want me to be? So those are some. I think that answers your question, Amanda.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I hear you saying that you lean into your faith because you assume and know that God is working and wants to work something in you and through you, probably.
Yeah, to be expectant in a crisis, not just, oh, this is terrible. Well, maybe it's terrible, but what are we learning? And
right.
What's God saying? Right.
Right. So hear the invitation rather than the interruption, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
What about you, Jamie?
Well, when Amanda sent this question today, because it was an add-on, right? So you kind of skipped to the bottom now, right? Okay. So this is just what I wrote today after thinking about that question. And I just said, I've been a Christian for over 40 years, and I've been through, I've probably not been through as much as maybe some people have, but I feel like I've been through quite a bit of stuff. And I guess when this sort of happened, it came to the realization that my faith has sunk pretty deep into my heart and into my spirit. And so I think for me, it's been finding ways to be thankful for the things that I don't understand and the things that I don't see. And so that's kind of how I answered that question today.
I'm going to just reflect back to you on that, because I think that is a very good point. I think sometimes in Christian culture, we can kind of want to explain things or lean into the why. And it sounds to me like you said, there's some mystery about what is going on. And rather than letting that scare you, you can find a place of thankfulness from that. And I do think particularly where congregations are more intellectually driven and we do try to disciple through thought, we can try to explain some of this. And I think that's a great gift to all of us listening, Jamie, to think about the mystery. And I think it links into mine. Like, I'll just say, I think two things. One is I constantly reminding myself of God's character. Like, I think He's unchanging. This didn't catch Him by surprise. And that's actually the thing that matters the most. And so I think just seeing it's a good exposure of where my security lies, and just a reminder of like, right, it is the Lord. But I also think I think staying in how I would say it is someone, or it wasn't even someone, I was just thinking about, oftentimes we look at like, stress and suffering. And I wouldn't even say suffering maybe so much in our context, like we really have a lot. But sometimes we talk about the testing of our faith, and it's always like we have to prove in some way our faith or our value to God. And what I realize is sometimes, and this is what Jamie's answer was getting at too, is I think sometimes suffering reveals the quality of our faith to us. And I feel like sometimes the focus has been like, oh, we're testing in our faith, and so God knows the quality of our faith. And actually, we are, and sometimes it will surprise us by its depth, and maybe sometimes surprise us by its lack of depth or how shaky it is. And so maybe we learn it's deeper than we thought or less. And so I think I've been reflecting on that too, about where my faith is and how deep my foundations are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just as like the last couple of questions, we're just going to shift a little bit, but I just wanted to pause here because we're just going to talk about work, ministry, but also work rhythms. And I wanted to ask if anyone, just as we're talking about personal, does anyone have a question they want to throw out there to us specifically? So if you want to just wave your hand and unmute yourself or type it in the chat box, because I do want to give you some time to ask a specific or follow up to that.
Mm-hmm. Or add to something that we've said.
I am just a bit curious if we can pause for a second. I would like to hear either from like the demographics that we haven't talked about. So I like parents managing with kids, anything that you're like, oh yeah, I've had an aha moment listening, or we've just learned this section, or we're watching our kids process, or the retirees, like has something kind of caught you by surprise in this season. Maybe you're loving it. Maybe you're like, oh, this is like life hasn't changed, or yeah. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to pipe their hand up and say something. Well, we can just keep moving ahead.
Brian has his hand up.
Oh,
Actually,
Brian's gonna go, and then I think
for us, because of where we live, really we've had very little change, other than not quite as much contact with people. And we miss going to church, but we've been following the YouTube service and everything, so we haven't seen as much of our kids, but we've been Zooming them and so on. So
life hasn't changed that much for Brian. What about for the fathers with the children over there?
I think our life is completely changed. But one of the aspects actually that Sally just whispered in was we seem to be having more family time. So, I mean, I'm getting the opportunity, good or bad, to see Katie throughout the day, even if I'm trying to work from home or do anything else. So we're actually spending more time around each other, which is kind of a really wonderful thing that may have come out of here. Or horrible.
Yeah, at the beginning, Mark, I was sitting in a prayer meeting with some people from Canada, from like international and national, I can't remember which one, and they were just praying that this time would be a refocusing on the family unit immediate, because there's just, it seems like everyone's kind of busy, and you're picking your kid up, driving them somewhere else, and so they were just really praying that this would be an opportunity for families to come together again. Yeah,
I think it's a little bit like looking at the cup half full or half empty. Well, if you choose to say, "Hey, it's half full," you're a little more positive, and you can look for what are the learnings and what are the big good takeaways, right? So,
well, you can feel free to type in something in the text moving forward if you have something to contribute. We're just going to talk about our work life now. So I know we're in ministry, but the reality is we're still all working full-time jobs. And basically, I feel like I got a whole new job. I don't know. I mean, not a whole new job. I spent some of my time at the computer, but I know a bunch of you also have transitioned to work from home. Maybe some of you, it hasn't changed at all. So we're going to talk about what are some of the big work takeaways from this season as you've approached your work differently or had to transition. So what are some of your takeaways? Jamie, why don't you start?
So the takeaways of the season, that's what you want me to answer?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, the things that I was reflecting on as I thought about this answer was the changes in our world are big. They happened really fast, and because of it, a lot of people got more tech savvy really quickly. So that's been interesting to see. And I guess what's been going on in my mind is how can we continue to reach out to the people who don't come on Sundays all the time? What's church going to look like down the road in the future because of what we're going through right now? Mm-hmm. Another one that if I were to look at, some of the changes where Zoom prayer meetings are awesome. And so I know Mark and I have had that discussion as well, and like they're really great. And the other thing, the last thing that I said was that that it's important that we keep learning in this season in a work perspective, but not to compare what others are doing.
Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, I think it kind of ties into a lot of things we've already said. One of them is not to try to return to normal. I think most people listening on this call, this Zoom, and would say, as we return, we want to return to obviously a lot of the things that we've been doing in our church, but there are some things that we've started that we want to keep doing, and perhaps not do some of the things that we used to do. And I think we should celebrate that. So, again, the analogy I would use is, imagine if you went for you parked your car at one of the carpool areas, got your bike and went for a long ride, and you came back to the carpool and your car was gone. That would be a shock, and you would be, and I think a little bit as we have now been on the bike for 8 weeks, 9 weeks, riding COVID-19, I don't want to go back to the car. I hope the car is moved. I hope I have to go find the car, because while I want some things to return, I think crisis has been a tremendous opportunity to reevaluate a lot of things that we're doing and to re-enter the new normal in a fresh way, and especially when it comes to social media, it is unquestionable. So I don't want to try and return to everything that was normal. I want a little bit of it. I want a lot of it, but I want to integrate a lot of the change that's, I think, been God-given.
So before you all freak out and think Mark is never going to come back to church ever again, that is not what he's saying.
No.
So we pulled it high level there because we wanted to I just wanted to be like, if you're like, oh no, there's going to be no car/church, what are we doing? We kind of tried to make it a high level discussion so you can think about in your own jobs, perhaps some of the things that have changed or not. I think for me, a couple things were mentioned, but I think one, don't compare yourself to others and what other businesses are doing, because you're not them. And you have your specific people with your gift mix, and that is what you have to do. And so I think not comparing. I also think that good enough, like I think when I think in my job specifically, how oftentimes, Mark was alluding to this a bit, but I think sometimes when things get good, you make minor things into major things. And I think when all of a sudden you had to cut back so much, I don't know if you found this in some of your jobs, or maybe people have reflected this to you. Suddenly there's like, you realize, oh, this is actually important. And some of these other things that we thought were important, we can actually get away with like not doing or doing a less better job on them. And that's actually okay. And letting it be that. So I've actually enjoyed that. I think one of the last things I would say, big takeaways, is what I have learned from my community of people around me is I think all of us probably have an idea of what we should be doing for our jobs, but it's not until all of it's taken away and we're renegotiating that we learn actually, this is my contribution to the team. Like when everyone else is trying to work remotely, this is where my edge is and my gift is to the community. And it's like a lot of other things that I filled my time with, I'm kind of like, oh, maybe that wasn't as necessary as I thought. And so, I mean, that can be fearful because you're like, wow, I, maybe thought I was so important or thought these things were important. But at the same time, I think everyone has a unique contribution to their team, their work environment, and to let people tell you what that is has been helpful, if not surprising. So so that's some of the stuff I've been learning, and we kind of wanted to grab on that, I think, for all of us, because we were just talking about, for a long, the first 4 or 5 weeks, everyone's like, oh, we're going to go back to normal. I think it's clear that there is going to be a new normal. And so how do you start to look at what we can walk into that new normal with, and at the same time not lose out some of the history that we have? So we are going to talk about just the church, because I know some of you had said you wanted to hear from the pastoral staff a little bit about just what we think about church and moving forward. And we don't have clear answers yet, but I guess 2 questions we wanted to end with, and then we can have any Q&A. But one would be, where and how have you seen God at work? And I actually forgot, as I'm reading this in my notes, was something we'd love to hear from you. Where have you seen God at work, or seen people caring for each other in a way maybe that is unique to this, and we don't want to lose it? So if you want to just think about how you've seen God at work, and you can type it in the chat and we can read that out. But maybe Mark or Jamie, you want to start with just some of the ways you've seen God at work in these last couple of weeks, particularly as it pertains to Bethel.
Yeah. Well, I think my answer actually applies to both questions here at the end. I think we've seen God at work in developing intimacy in unexpected ways through Zoom. And I know Zoom isn't great. I know it's fatiguing and all of that. But I have seen in a lot of meetings I've been in, moving from just talking about an agenda, and I'm talking about in meetings with people who aren't Christ followers, to talking about the heart, talking about your feeling, talking about some of your stresses and family issues. And there's been a much deeper bond and a deeper connection that the crisis actually, I think, has brought on. in those kinds of meetings. And then also in church meetings, I've sat in meetings where, hey, before we start, let's go around and introduce ourselves, because 75% of people in the Hollywood squares don't know each other. So this has brought much deeper intimacy. And there's great intimacy when, here are different scenes that come to mind. You're in a meeting and all of a sudden a child starts screaming. Now, what meetings have you been in before where a child starts screaming and you can say, oh, that's your child, introduce me. That's the context. Or a dog starts barking, or a grandchild sits on a grandfather's lap while we're in a meeting with a team, and the granddaughter is interacting with the team and waving. I mean, there's deeper intimacy. Or in our prayer meetings, there was a couple in our prayer meeting who were like lying in bed. I mean, they had their clothes on. They weren't in their pajamas, but they're lying in bed, horizontal, joining us. And then there's a mother running around the kitchen getting breakfast ready for her kids that are about to wake up, and another dad who is caring for his kids, and they're joining in. And so there's a whole level of intimacy, because you actually see into people's homes, and you see them in the unshaven, or the hair's a mess. My hair's never a mess, but and it's just a deeper intimacy. So I think that's it's been a wonderful opportunity, and I think God will continue to work in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just going to respond to Mark. I think that is one of the key things where I feel like we have sort of lost hospitality in the church as a key thing. And I'm not saying necessarily through Zoom we got it back, but we were kind of forced to be in people's homes. And so, if they, I'm wearing sweatpants right now, truth be told, but you can't tell. There's just a sense of we can see all of your backgrounds wherever you're sitting, and I would never get to see that. And that does create more context. It's you and your space. And I also echo Mark. I hope we don't lose that going forward. Yeah. Jamie?
The thing that's been on my, as I thought about this question, was just how the churches, and I can't really speak to this, but I know that Carolyn and Janet Lee have mentioned this a lot to me. Just watching people come together in the city, and how the crisis has brought lots of churches together, and I have certainly seen that in I work with a curriculum company, and I have just been absolutely amazed to watch how all of the groups that I'm in this curriculum company have come together, and there's been a sharing of ideas, and there's been just stuff flowing out of, because of the crisis, and the amount of free stuff, right, that people have just been, here, just use this. So anyway, so I just think that, John 13, where Jesus says, I want the church to be one, is kind of happening. So.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just going to say too, though, I think there's lots of learnings we're getting from being on social media platforms, lessons we can take back into face-to-face realities, because that is the ultimate, right? Like, at the end of the day, I don't want to stay like this, but this has taught us a ton of lessons.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I see God at work in a lot of ways, because I do think, and I use this analogy in a post, I think that there is a stripping happening, but it's like furniture, right? You're getting all the paint off and all the things that maybe were in the way, so you can get back to what it's supposed to be. But in the end, there is no substitute for incarnational experience. I think we learn that we can, Zoom prayer meetings, or perhaps even maybe with, I'm looking at Steve Dickey on the board, we actually could just have a 30-minute Zoom meeting just to touch base in the future that would allow for stuff maybe that was a little bit more, okay, now we have to have about this whole, I think we've learned that real things can happen, but virtual community should only really reflect what is already happening in person. Digital shouldn't become the way, and that's not and that I think echoes some of what just MJ's comment of feeling a little bit like the opposite of just missing out on people. There was a point, even for my context, I was counting down the days since I'd had a hug, because I just wasn't touched. There is no substitute for incarnational ministry, but I think the resiliency of people, and even I know with some of the demographics, just to get online, to be able to connect, and seeing that it was possible, but having to work at it. has just been really encouraging for us as leaders to see how important community, and for all of you to come out, sit in your homes and hear us kind of talk about this is just, it's very encouraging to us to see people try and connect and actually to see your faces and all the undoneness and the lack of haircuts and the like all of that. So yeah.
I was gonna,
yeah.
Can I just go ahead?
Jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, I think a lot of this digital stuff too, social media platforms, is a little bit like the foyer. That when we get back to face, digital platforms are the foyer. Are for a lot of people going to be the first entrance in. It's safe. I could be anonymous, but the goal is to bring people into face to face. For those that are within driving distance of our church. But the beauty of the social media platforms is we can now reach people in China. We can have people join our services like Julia from Australia. And it's, so, but I think this is a great foyer to move people into a deeper experience of being in the same room, flesh, face to face. So.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I would just add too, though, that we can't go back technologically wise. It's one of those things where I feel like maybe in the old models of church, you would add something on, you would master the skill, and then that would be it. But the reality is technology is a constantly developing field. And so I just speak for me. I think truthfully, a lot in my generation and down, we do connect online. That is the way we feel we know each other. And so this is the future of the church, but it will never substitute. Like, I think Mark's right. It's the foyer. But our concern, and Mark and I were talking about this today, is like people attending church, online isn't getting them into the transformational relationships that happen, right? Like God himself is 3 in 1. There is nothing that substitutes for relationship and real life interaction. So that's a question we will hold together as a community as we kind of try to figure this out and how to get people plugged in as we move forward. So that is, we're going to just wind it to kind of a close there. And I just wanted to give if anyone has, I'm seeing some comments in the side, we've addressed some of them. But I just wanted to know if there's any specific questions or things that you want to just bring to our attention that you're thinking about or wondering while we have you here or you have us here. So feel free to shove your hand up or unmute.
John just wrote something about creativity.
So feel free to read it if you want to. Go ahead, Jamie.
I agree with Jamie that something creative is a great outlet. At the beginning of this isolation thingy, and Vixen gave birth to 8 foxes. Oh yeah, the foxes. I remember that downtown. About 4 blocks from my front door. If anyone wants to hang around after we close, I'd be happy to share some pictures. It's therapeutic in my humble opinion. I've enjoyed looking at those pictures actually. I saw Mike Barrett's pictures too of the foxes as well, and that was so cool.
I think that is reflective though, and even like seeing Ross's comments about like I initially and still do. I think people have maybe we have taken some of our relationships for granted, and and even the simple things like foxes, like things we would have, like my commute is no longer just my commute. It becomes a space to pray, right? Mark's walking outside. It's not just I'm walking my dog. Now I can pay attention to what's going on. And so I think there's a massive invitation going forward for us to say, what does it mean to like slow down and not just fill our schedules again because we can suddenly go out. And that's personal, I think, as a family also. And then as a church, like what is the real stuff of our calling in the world? So on that note, if that's okay, we thought we would just end actually by reading aloud. You don't have to unmute, but I'm just going to post the Lord's Prayer in the box. And the reason we're doing this is because we're going to start a sermon series on the Lord's Prayer. And so we thought, why not end by just praying God's kingdom and declaring God's kingdom in this season, even though we don't really know what it's yet going to look like in the future. So I'm just going to, I guess maybe Mark, Jamie, and I will read it out loud. Maybe Mark, you can just read it out loud. I'll mute myself and then everyone can just read along in the chat box. I've posted it. And then I'll just end us. So Mark, you want to take it?
Yeah. So Lord, hear our prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
So thank you all for showing up, participating. A couple just quick housekeeping updates. Just a reminder that we have a prayer meeting at noon on Friday if you'd like to join. Also, if you want, I think there's a coffee and conversation. We're going to try that out on Sunday at 11 a.m. And that is purely, we're encouraging you to listen to the service beforehand, just so we have, kind of a conversation starter, but then just to connect and have people meet. So that's at 11 a.m. All of these are on our event page, like you got to this event. And if there's formats or topics like this in the future where you think, oh, I'd love to, and it's not that you have to hear from staff all the time, but if you're like, this would be an interesting topic in this season to just have some maybe experts or people in our community dialogue on, drop me an email and we can do that. But just I really appreciate your time. Thank you all for coming out. It's so good to see your faces. And that is it for tonight, unless Margaret, Jamie has anything to add.
I'm good. I'm out.
Good.
We're all good.
Thank
Okay,
you,
thank you, everyone. Hopefully you have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.